Hey everybody, today I want to talk about this spinal cord cross-section model. And just as the name implies, this is a cross-section of the spinal cord. It's a horizontal section of the spinal cord and we're looking down on it. So this is a superior view. Now this whole structure right here is the spinal cord. And this is the white matter of the spinal cord. This is the gray matter of the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. It's a really delicate structure, and so we want to protect it. And so something that's not shown here is that this spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. Here's an individual vertebra. This is a thoracic vertebra. Here's the body. And each vertebra has a large hole in it called the vertebral foramen. And what happens is that when you stack these vertebrae on top of each other, these vertebral foramen line up and they form the vertebral canal. And that's where the spinal cord passes through, is the vertebral canal. So you have all of this nice bony protection from the vertebral column that's protecting the spinal cord. So here we are, and we're looking down on this. This is a superior view, but we still want to know which way is forward and which way is back. And to do that, you want to look for this structure right here. It's this relatively large crease or gap, and this is called the anterior median fissure. Anterior because it's in the front. It's on the front side of the spinal cord, or the front side of the body. Median because it's in the middle, and fissure just means a large crease. So this is a large crease that's on the front middle portion of the spinal cord, and it's a good landmark to know which way is front, which way is anterior, and which way is posterior. Related to that, on the back, you have this structure called the posterior median sulcus. Posterior back, median middle, and sulcus is just a shallow crease. And so that's the identifier for the posterior side. Okay, so running right down the middle of the spinal cord, right in the middle of the gray matter here, is a hole. It's a canal, and that is called the central canal. And can anybody guess, or does anybody know what passes down the central canal? Cerebral spinal fluid is going to pass down the central canal. And cerebral spinal fluid is made in the ventricles of the brain, and those ventricles are continuous with the central canal. So it passes from the ventricles of the brain down through the central canal, and then eventually it's going to make its way around the spinal cord. It's that cerebral spinal fluid is going to bathe the spinal cord. It's going to surround the spinal cord the same way it does in the brain. And that leads us into the next component, which are what are called these meninges. So there's three protective layers that wrap around the spinal cord, and these are the same protective layers, the same meninges that are found wrapping around the brain. The outer layer is called the dura mater. Dura means tough, mater is mother, so it's the tough mother. And this is made up of tough fibrous tissue. A lot of collagen fibers, dense irregular connective tissue, I imagine. And it's the job of the dura mater to enclose the spinal cord and enclose all of the fluids around the spinal cord as well. And again, this same meninge, the dura mater, has the same function around the brain. It encloses the brain and all the fluids of the brain. The next layer is called the arachnoid mater. And the arachnoid motor, arachnoid means spider, because I guess it has these spidery projections. And the arachnoid motor forms this space called the subarachnoid space. And what's going to happen is the cerebral spinal fluid in the central canal is eventually going to make its way into the subarachnoid space, and it's going to fill this space. So this allows the cerebral spinal fluid to surround the spinal cord, to bathe the spinal cord, you know, to give it buoyancy, to give it protection, and also to deliver products and remove metabolic waste products. And then lastly, the final meninge is what we call the pia mater, the delicate mother. And the pia mater is going to follow the individual convolutions, the individual contours of the spinal cord. And it's going to provide a connective tissue component that allows small blood vessels that are going to serve the spinal cord. It gives them a kind of a connective tissue component to latch onto, to hang on to. All right, and then we've got these structures over here. Now, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and the job is going to be to take information to and from the brain for the most part. But these structures here are part of the peripheral nervous system. And this specific structure is an individual spinal nerve. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves that go into and out of the spinal cord, and this is one of those right there. And most, if not all, of the spinal nerves are what we call mixed nerves. And what that means is that this spinal nerve is going to carry both sensory information that's going to go toward the spinal cord, and it's also going to carry motor information away from the spinal cord. Now, something to maybe ask yourself is, if this spinal cord is wrapped around by the vertebra, it's protected by the vertebra, then how do these spinal nerves gain access to the spinal cord? And the answer to that, let's see. Here's a couple vertebrae that are stacked on top of each other. There's the vertebral canal, but when you stack these, when you stack these vertebrae on top of each other, it forms this hole in between them called the intervertebral foramen. In between the vertebra, a hole in between the vertebra. And essentially what's going to happen is that's when the spinal nerves move towards the spinal cord, they're going to pass through that intervertebral foramen, and that's how they're going to gain access to the spinal cord. So the spinal nerve comes in, it passes through the intervertebral foramen, which would be right about there, and then something interesting happens. It branches. And this branch in the back is called the dorsal root. Dorsal is another word for posterior. You can think of a dorsal fin on a fish or a whale, for instance, on the back. That's how I remember this is the dorsal root and back. And then this in front here is called the ventral root. And something interesting is going to happen. All of the sensory neurons that are traveling through this spinal nerve, they're detecting sensory information somewhere in the body, and they're bringing that information via sensory neurons through this spinal nerve. Once they get past the intervertebral foramen, all of those sensory neurons are going to travel back through the dorsal root. And they're going to travel back through the dorsal root. They're going to synapse with a spinal cord neuron and interneuron in the gray matter, and then that information is going to go up to the brain to be processed. So all of the sensory information coming through this spinal nerve travels back here through the dorsal root. And one other important note is that you have this bulgy region right here. This is called the dorsal root ganglion. And sensory neurons are a little bit different. Their cell bodies are located a little bit different than most neurons. So what happens is you have the sensory receptor region out here, the dendritic region that detects sensory information, that travels along through the axon, through the spinal nerve, and then the cell body for the sensory neuron is not found until you hit this bulgy area right here, which we call the dorsal root ganglion. So all of the cell bodies of all of the sensory neurons that are traveling through this spinal nerve are found in the dorsal root ganglion right there. So again, that sensory neuron comes in, it synapses with an interneuron in the gray matter. Then what happens is that information travels through the white matter up towards the brain. It travels through these locations in the white matter that we call ascending tracts. And those are basically axons that are taking that information up to the brain to be processed. The brain is going to process that information. It's going to decide a motor response, and it's going to send that information down what we call descending pathways, which are also located in the white matter. And those neurons traveling through the descending pathways, their job is going to be to activate motor neurons. So they synapse with the cell body of a motor neuron in the gray matter, and then that motor neuron travels out through the ventral root, joins up to the spinal nerve, and then it eventually makes its way out to the effector organ that it's going to activate, most likely a skeletal muscle.